rather bless someone than punish someone, okay? And I think that's probably true of most people, too. We would rather do something good for somebody than punish them. And that's definitely God's nature. So God's nature is to shower blessings, not to shower punishment and curses on people, if possible. Okay, so he says he delights in his mercy, and then he goes on to say, he says he will again have compassion on us. So at some point in the future, God is going to have compassion on them, but only on the remnant, not the entirety of the country, just on the remnant. He will subdue our iniquities. You will cast out all of our sins into the depth of the sea. So God will get rid of all their sins and look past them. And then 20, it says, you will give truth to Jacob and mercy to Abraham. He's just calling to mind the promises that he originally made to Abraham and Jacob, that God is still in the process of keeping these promises. And what he's touching on here is that despite Judah and Israel's sin and their iniquity and all the bad stuff they've done, God is still going to carry out his will, okay? And that's something we need to keep in mind when we live in such a wicked world today. God is still going to, one, he's still in control. Two, he's still going to carry out his purpose with or without us, okay? You can either be on the winning team with him or you can be on the losing team. But God is still going to carry out his purpose whether we're on board with it or not, okay? And so what he's saying is he is still going to carry out his purpose with the remnant, but all the unfaithful ones, they're going to get punished, okay? But the remnant, God is going to carry out his purpose through them. He's going to bring the remnant back to Israel at some point in the future. And then the ultimate goal of the remnant is what? Is to provide a nation through which the Savior will enter the world, okay? And so he's saying that he's going to carry this out through them. And then he goes on to say, which you have sworn to our fathers from days of old. And so he's just, finishing the statement by just making sure there's not another verse, by just reiterating the fact that he is going to bless the remnant, forgive them of their sins, and that he will carry out his purpose through them. So Micah ends with a message of hope. There's a lot of negativity in the book as a whole because he spends a lot of time talking about all the punishment and all the iniquity that they've done. But he does end with a message of hope at the end. And that is the end of Micah. Does anybody have any questions on Micah? Okay. So Micah is pretty similar to Hosea and Amos, but directed at Judah instead of directed at Israel. It's also similar to lots of Isaiah as well. Okay. We're going to move over to Nahum now. And Nahum, we're just going to go through some of the introduction tonight. So Nahum is going to be vastly different than a lot of the other books. It's going to be more close to Obadiah than it is to the ones we've been doing. So Nahum is a message not to God's people. It is a message to God's people, but it's not a message to them about their problems and their sins. It is a message about how God is going to punish Assyria, okay? So if you recall, a lot of what was talked about in Amos and Hosea and Micah is how Israel and Judah had been bad, and as a result, God was going to use a country to come in and punish them, okay? And that country was going to be Assyria. So Assyria was a tool that God used to punish his people. However, Assyria went beyond what God wanted them to be as a tool, which is not really surprising based on who the Assyrians were. And they did more damage than what God really wanted of them to do, okay? And God knew they would do that. And so the Assyrians were very ruthless people. When they would go in and conquer people, they were very ruthless, would do things beyond what was really necessary in war. And so as a result of that, God is going to in turn punish them for what they did to his people, okay? And that's going to be what Nahum's about. Nahum's going to be prophesying about how Assyria is going to fall as a result of their sins. Okay, so Nahum, The name, if I can clear my throat well enough to say it, it's not really an H. It's a different letter. It's Nahum. You have to kind of roll it in your back of your throat. Nahum, like that. I'll just say Nahum, the rest of the class, though. His name means consolation or consoler, so somebody that consoles someone else. It's kind of similar to Noah's name. Noah means rest, okay? There are some other people in the Old Testament with a part of the name Nahum in it, like Menahem, Nehemiah, and then actually there's an ancestor of Jesus who has the name Nahum. But it's not a super common name. Okay, so nothing is known about him outside of his book. And the only thing he mentions about himself is he's from a town called NLCOC. But nobody knows where NLCOC is. All right, so it's kind of assumed it's probably somewhere in Judah because Israel isn't in existence at this point. But where it's at, nobody really knows. He doesn't mention his father's name, and because of the way NLCOC is listed, and this is kind of a Hebrew grammar thing that you don't really care about, but I'll just say that he's probably not in NLCOC when he's doing his prophesying, okay? Just like Micah was not in his hometown when he was prophesying. He's probably living somewhere else and working as a prophet, but he's just saying that this is where I'm from originally. And that's kind of the idea of what he's talking about. Does anybody know a town in the New Testament that has the name Nahum in it? And it won't be intuitively obvious because of the way we spell it and pronounce it in English. We got one right up front, but nobody else could hear him but me. Anybody else know? It's Capernaum, and I'll show it to you in a second. Okay, so if you take off caper off the front of it, and you'll see it's N-A-U-M, it's just missing the H, right? So Capernaum literally means village of Nahum. But it's named after some other guy named Nahum. It has nothing to do with the prophet Nahum. This is more of just a fun fact. But Capernaum is a very prominent city in the New Testament, and it does have the name Nahum in the name. Okay, all right, so there's a Muslim tradition that states that Nahum's tomb is at Al-Qush, which is about 25 miles north of Mosul, Iraq. A lot of Jews, Christians, and Muslims revere that particular area, but it's probably nothing more than tradition, and it dates back to about the 16th century. So if he really was buried there, what that would imply is that his ancestors would have been taken captive into Assyria when the Assyrians took Israel in 722, okay? So that would have meant he would have grown up in Assyria and then prophesied in Assyria, but he says himself that he's from NLCOC, so that's probably not true. He probably grew up somewhere in Judah and then worked and prophesied in Judah. But just to let you know that there is a Muslim tradition that states this. By the way, the Muslims revere some of our prophets, the Old Testament prophets, particularly Jonah and Nahum. I'll show you some stuff about that in a minute. So they acknowledge a lot of this stuff is true, okay? All right, so when did he prophesy? It's really hard to say exactly when he prophesied. The earliest date would be around 669, and why is that? He alludes to the Assyrian defeat of Egypt at Thebes in chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. So that occurred in 669 when Esarhaddon, who was king of Assyria, took over that part of Egypt, and then later the next king, Ashurbanipal, finished the job. So that would be the earliest possible date that he prophesied. The latest possible date would be the fall of Nineveh itself, which occurs in 612 BC. But most scholars think that he's prophesying about Nineveh falling, not recapping the events after they have already happened. Okay, so it would probably be somewhere between 669 and 612, and most scholars think it's probably a little bit closer to the 612 date than the 669. But to get any more exact than that, you really can't do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Assyria for a while. This is going to be the part in the intro where if you don't like history, you just take a nap for a little bit. I find this pretty fascinating, but it's going to be a lot of names and people you've probably never heard of, and just if you want to kind of blank out, the gist of it is Assyria is a really strong world power for about 200 years. They're a major player in the world scene for a long, long time, over 1,000 years. But in terms of being the dominant world power, they're the dominant world power for a little over 200 years, okay? And so what happens to them is they go from their height of power to completely being destroyed in about 20 to 30 years, okay? So they go from being on top to completely gone as a nation in about 30 years, okay? So if you want to ignore the rest of this, that's kind of the gist of a lot of what we're about to talk about. All right, so Assyria is going to be very strong up until the death of a king called Ashurbanipal in 627, okay? And so over the next, well, really it's only 15 years. Over the next 15 years, the Medes, Scythians, and Babylonians fight against them, and they lose some major battles at Tarbisu and Ashur in 614, and then Nineveh ultimately falls in 612. They do try to hang on for a few more years with some couple people that become king very briefly, but basically, for the most part, after 612, they're gone, okay? And so Babylon becomes the major world power after that. Okay, so let's kind of go back and recap. So a lot of what I'm about to talk about, we have talked about already with some of the intros to the other books, but just to sort of review some of it, and so you can kind of get a picture of what's going on. We'll kind of start back through some of this. So Assyria was a country for back into the 2500s or something like that, but they never really went west, okay? So they're hanging out over there. Assyria and Babylon are kind of hanging out over there, but they're not coming west towards Egypt for a long time, okay? But around 1114 BC, Tiglath-Pileser I, he starts to make his way west, but he doesn't really interact with Israel at this time, okay? So that's kind of their first foray into going west, but they don't really cause any issues for Israel then. Fast forward about 250 years, and during the reign of Nasrpal II, Assyria gets tribute from Phoenicia, so they go all the way to the coast, and they fight against Phoenicia, but they don't go against Damascus. Damascus is also called Aram. It's also called Syria. Damascus at that time is the same city of Damascus today, same place. Syria is still Syria. Okay, so if you know where Syria is on the map, and I'll show you a map in a minute, it hadn't changed locations in thousands of years. Okay, same place. All right, so they went to Phoenicia, but they didn't do anything against Syria or Israel at that point. Now you fast forward a little bit further, in 853, you have a very famous battle that's mentioned in the Bible, the Battle of Karkar, when Shalmaneser III defeats King Ahab of Israel, Hadadezer of Damascus, and a few other allies. So you had multiple countries that went together to fight against Assyria, including Israel, and they lost, okay? So what do you think is going to happen after you lose to a world power? You're probably going to become a vassal. So Shalmaneser III makes Israel a vassal state during the reign of Jehu. Jehu's the king of Israel. And Jehu is memorialized on an Assyrian inscription on the Black Obelisk. The Black Obelisk, I think, is in the British Museum in London, if you want to check it out. And so Shalmaneser III says that he mentions the tribute of Jehu, the son of Omri. Assyria calls Israel Omri land for a long time. Not quite like Disneyland, but that's what they call it. So instead of calling it Israel, they call it the land of Omri. That's what the Assyrians call Israel, even long after Omri's gone. That's what they still call it. And then you move fast forward some more to Adad-Nirari III, and he takes tribute from Tyre, Sidon, Omri, or Israel, Edom, and Palestine. So you just see how they're moving further and further west, taking control more and more of these countries. After Jeroboam II died in 742, that's when Israel really starts to fall apart. Remember, Israel is going to fall apart completely in 722, but Jeroboam II dies in 742. And the last 25 years of Israel's chaos, and we've talked about that a lot. So Israel becomes politically unstable, and then Tiglath-Pileser III, who is also called Pul or Pul in your Old Testament, depending on your Bible translation, he may have either name. Same guy, could have either name in the Bible. He invades Israel in 742 after Jeroboam II dies, and he takes tribute from Menahem. Menahem is listed in Assyrian records as a vassal of Tiglath-Pileser III, along with Hiram of Tyre, Rezin of Damascus, and some others. So Assyria now has Israel as a vassal kingdom. They're not really doing much against Judah yet, but Israel is basically a vassal at this point, okay? Assyrian records do mention a guy named Azariah of Iudah, which is likely Azariah of Judah. It's just the way they spell it in Assyria. Is also recorded as paying tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III at this time, okay? So both Israel and Judah are paying tribute, but Israel is more of a true vassal. Judah is maybe not really a vassal, but more like giving them money to kind of appease them. Okay. Soon thereafter, Pekah, so after Menahem, you have Pekah. Pekah is king of Israel, and Rezin is king of Aram, a.k.a. Syria, a.k.a. Damascus. Okay. If you remember, Syria and Israel border each other. So they are frenemies. Sometimes they like each other. Most of the time they hate each other. But occasionally they will fight together against somebody else. Okay. So what happens is Israel and Syria team up, and they say, hey, let's fight against Assyria and see if we can get rid of them, because we're giving them a ton of money, and this isn't really working out for us to be vassals. So they know they're not strong enough on their own to defeat Assyria, so they try to pull Judah into it. And Ahaz is your king of Judah at that point, and Ahaz says no thanks, okay? He doesn't want to get involved with Assyria in terms of fighting against them. He probably knows it's a losing battle. So instead of joining the alliance with Israel and Syria, he actually contacts Assyria and says, hey, I'll give you some money if you come knock off Syria and Israel for me. So don't get Assyria and Syria confused. I'll just quit saying Syria. I'll call them Damascus or something else. That way it doesn't confuse you or sound the same. All right, so you got Damascus and Israel teaming up, trying to pull Judah into it, and Judah says no. And Judah actually contacts the pagan country of Assyria to help them against their brothers, Israel. You can kind of think about the irony of that for a minute. So as a result, Judah becomes a vassal of Assyria, and once you become a vassal to another country, you kind of have to adopt some of their religion, okay? And so Ahaz puts up an altar in the temple for one of the Assyrian deities, which was a huge mistake. But Assyria does do what they say. They come in and they defeat Israel and Israel and Damascus. And so Judah is safe from those two countries as a result of this. All right, so moving on, fast forward. In 732, you got Tiglath-Pileser III. He takes Damascus, and he then takes Israel and takes some of their territory away from them. And then they take the Israel king off the throne, and they put a puppet king on the throne. And that puppet king is Hoshea. So Hoshea becomes king of Israel, but he's just really a vassal puppet king for Assyria. So then after Tiglath-Pileser III dies, you have a guy named Shalmaneser V who becomes king. He's not king very long because he dies. But he discovers that Hoshea, their puppet king for Israel, is trying to betray him. What he did was he reached out to Egypt to try to get them to fight against Assyria with them. And Egypt said no thanks. But since he did that, Shalmaneser V got upset, and he laid siege to Samaria, the capital of Israel, and they take the country over, and they take the city over. Now, Shalmaneser V will die before the siege is actually complete, and so his brother, Sargon II, becomes king of Assyria. And he finishes the job and defeats Samaria in 722. They take 27,290 Israelites captive, and then they spread them out throughout Assyria. Israel becomes an Assyrian province called Samarina, and then they move other people from other parts of Assyria into Israel to mix the population up. Okay, so now at this point, 722, Israel is no longer a country, and you're just left with Judah at this point. Okay, so after Sargon II dies, you got a guy named Sennacherib who becomes king of Assyria. He takes over Phoenicia and a lot of Philistia, so the coast, he takes over the coast. And then he comes into Judah, takes 46 of the walled cities and a bunch of other smaller cities from King Hezekiah in 701 BC. And we talked about all this when we talked about the background for Micah, okay? And he celebrated all this. He made a large wall relief in his palace about the capture of the major city in Judah that he took called Lachish. And you can see that in the British Museum too. That's where that is located. However, before he could take Jerusalem, God intervenes and destroys his whole army, and he has to go back home, embarrassed that he lost the entire army. Now, as kings did back at this time, he fails to kind of mention in his records how he lost his whole army, and he just brags about his successes. So when he gets back home, he still reigns for a while. One thing he's most important known for is moving the capital of Assyria from a place called Kala to Nineveh. Okay, so Nineveh, I'll talk about that in a minute. He gets eventually assassinated by his sons in 681, so 20 years after his little flop with the military in Judah. And then his son Esarhaddon becomes king. Esarhaddon, let's see how I'm doing on time. Esarhaddon listed 22 Western kings who paid tribute to him. The list includes Edom, Moab, the Philistines, and Manasseh of Judah. Okay, so he forced all these kings to travel all the way to Nineveh to personally supply him with building materials for his palace, basically a way to humiliate them by making them do that. He also put Manasseh in fetters and took him to Babylon. After Manasseh finally humbles himself before God, he is returned to Jerusalem. And the Bible only mentions that in a couple of verses, but Manasseh Esarhaddon made Manasseh look like a fool, basically. And he did a good job of it. Okay, so after Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, a.k.a. I think Ezra or Nehemiah, depending on your translation, may call him O-Snapper or Osnapper or however you want to pronounce it. But his name is Ashurbanipal. He becomes king, and he's really your last strong king of Assyria. And so he continues to expand into the Nile Valley. So Assyria's whole goal with going through Israel and Judah and Philistines and all that is really just to get to Egypt. That's what they're really trying to do, is take over Egypt. And he gets all the way into the Nile Valley. He's the one who spreads the country to its maximum height or maximum size. And he takes he takes troops from these other countries, including Judah. So Judah ends up having to give him troops, military personnel, to go fight against Egypt. Manasseh brings him gifts, he provides him with troops, and he's forced to kiss his feet. Okay, so he makes Manasseh look like an idiot, basically. In 663, Assyria does capture Thebes, and this is the furthest expanse into Egypt that they get. And so the bottom line of all this is that for over 200 years, Assyria oppresses both Judah and Israel, okay? And so that's kind of the picture I was trying to show. So do you think the Israelites and the Judeans liked Assyria? No, they hate them, okay? The entire Middle East hated them, all right, and for good reasons. But God's people in particular despise them. So if you have a prophet come along and says Assyria is going to fall flat on their face, do you think that might be a popular prophet? Probably, okay? His message is probably going to be well received, whereas a lot of the other prophets, they don't like listening to them. I would assume Nahum actually might be fairly popular for the message that he's going to give. Now, let's talk a little bit about Nineveh for a few minutes. Is Nineveh a real place, or is this a fairy tale made up in the Bible? It's a real place. Where is this real place? So Nineveh was at times the religious center of Assyria. So when you're reading Jonah would have been about, we'll just say 760, roughly, okay? When Jonah went to Nineveh, Nineveh was not the capital city of Assyria. It's confusing because some of the wording in the book, which we don't have time to talk about, but it was the religious capital city of the country, okay? So a lot of the shrines and temples and stuff were in Nineveh, but it wasn't the political capital at that particular time. The capital was another place about 10 miles down the river called Kala, which I'll show you in a minute. But by the time we are at Nahum, the capital has been moved to Nineveh. So for purposes of Nahum, the capital of Assyria is Nineveh, okay? All right, so it's first mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 10:11 as one of the cities founded by Nimrod, if you want to go back and check that out. And archaeological excavations have found the lowest levels of the city date to around the time of 4500 BC, which would make sense because that should be roughly around the time of Nimrod, okay? Nineveh today is represented by the archaeological site known as Kyunchik. It has a mound that's 90 feet high and measures a half mile by a quarter mile. Another mound known as Nebi Yunus is 1 mile to the south. Anybody want to know what Nebi Yunus in Arabic means in English? Okay, so the Hebrew word for prophet is Navi. Hebrew and Arabic are similar languages, if you didn't know that. They're both Semitic languages, so a lot of the words will sound similar between the two. So prophet in Hebrew is Navi, prophet in Arabic is Nebi. And who would be a prophet named Yunus? This is Jonah, okay? So the Muslims know all about Jonah and where Jonah went, all right? And I'll show you in a second. His mound is a mile south of this. Nineveh is located on the other side of the river from Mosul, Iraq. Okay. All right, so is Nineveh a made-up place? No, this is actually the names of the provinces of Iraq. And if you notice in the northwest corner, you have a province named Nineveh. They still call it that. All right. So here is Google Maps as of last night. And you see Iraq in the center. Right there, Baghdad is in the very center. If you go to the very south, down on the coast there, there's Basra. What Old Testament character is roughly from the area of Basra? Roughly. Abraham, excellent. Ken's tearing it up tonight. Good job, Ken. Abraham is from Ur of Babylon. Babylon is southern Iraq. And Ur specifically is roughly around Basra. So Babylon is down here, Assyria is up here. And if you notice, you probably can't read it, but Mosul is basically the dead center of my circle right there. It's in the north part of Iraq. Okay, so I'll blow it up just for kicks. You got Syria over here, and Damascus is going to be right there in the middle of the circle. And of course, Israel's here with Jerusalem. So all this time I was telling you about them, Assyria coming from here over and fighting against Damascus, Jerusalem, blah, blah, blah. Okay. All right, so let's blow Mosul up. Here's Mosul. The Tigris River runs down it. This is the Tigris River over here. And if you notice, you probably can't read that, but in the middle it says, Mosque of Prophet Jonah. So there's a mosque for Jonah right there. And then blow it up a little bit more. There is Nebi Yunus right there in the CC Mosul, and go right southeast of that. You'll see a line that says Nebi Yunus. That's Prophet Jonah. And if you go up from there to that, this is where the archaeological site for Nineveh is. Blow that up some more. Here's your archaeological site for Nineveh, and what you'll see in the dead center, that says Nineveh, Hill of Kianchik. Kianchik is the archaeological name. You have Sennacherib's palace right there, and you have Library of Ashurbanipal up there, and I don't see it. There's a temple that should be on there. I don't see it on that particular slide. Okay, and then this is the satellite map of it. So Sennacherib's palace is right here. The Library of Ashurbanipal is up there, which is a very famous library where they found thousands and thousands and thousands of written documents. And then that is the temple in the center there. So Nineveh was known as a place of worship for Asherah. So if you remember from Baal's consort, sexual partner, or whatever word you want to use, is Asherah. So they had a temple for her there. All right, so if you go south on the river, the Tigris River, about 10 miles, you'll come to another city, another archaeological site called Kala. Kala was the capital city of Assyria during Jonah's time. Jonah would not have gone here, but this would have been the capital when he went to Nineveh. And what you'll notice here is the ziggurat of Nimrud, and then over here is looks like I think it says Fort Shalmaneser, so it's one of the and there's the Technological Institute of Nimrod, by the way. if you want to go to school there, you're welcome to. So they have multiple things named after Nimrod, and this just blows it up a little bit more. You have Palace of Ashurnasirpal III. You have the Temple of Nabu. Nabu is one of their gods. Nabu So even though he's Babylonian, which we'll talk about later, but Nebuchadnezzar, his first part of his name, which we spell in English as Nebu, it's Nabu. Nabu is one of their gods. And so there's a temple there for Nabu. You have a ziggurat for Nimrod and so forth. So the point with all this is Nimrod's real, Jonah's real, Nahum is real, all these Assyrian kings are real, Nineveh is a real place, and all this is archaeological remains. And I actually did a biopsy just yesterday on a lady from Iraq, super nice lady, and she's from Baghdad originally, but I asked her if she'd ever been to Mosul, and she said no, but she knew about all these places, and she's like, yeah, I think ISIS messed up some of that stuff. And they did. They blew up what was supposedly the tomb of Jonah, or damaged it at least. But so the Muslims know all about these places, okay? So despite the fact people that know nothing in our country will try to tell you the Bible's fake, the Muslims know well and good that this stuff's real, all right? So it's kind of an interesting irony. But I wanted you to see that, and so if you're interested, just get on Google Earth, and you can find all this stuff on there. Here's the satellite map of the same place. You got the palace down here, and one of the temples up here, and so forth. So Nineveh was known to Sargon I of Akkad a long time ago in 2300 BC. It was a cult center for Inanna, also known as Ishtar, also known as Asherah. She has multiple names depending on what country you're talking about. Same goddess, same beliefs, basically. Very similar to Artemis and Diana once you get into Greek culture. And apparently people still worship this person today, even in our country. Some of our alleged celebrities supposedly are into some of this stuff. So Nineveh is mentioned in the prologue of the Code of Hammurabi, which Hammurabi is an ancient Assyrian king. He wrote a law code that's got some similarities to some of the stuff you find in the Pentateuch. And so he mentions Nineveh, and he also mentions that they have a temple there for Ishtar. And then Tiglath-Pileser the first, Ashur-Nasir-Pal the second, and Sargon, they all build palaces there over time. So Sennacherib, though, who is one of the main guys that will be relevant for Nahum, he brought Nineveh to its greatest glory. He made it the capital of Assyria. He built a palace there that was 9,800 square feet. He built an aqueduct and cut a channel to control flooding from the Kosar River. So there's a river that runs through the city that then connects with the Tigris River. And this is the river that supplied it with the city with water. And the city was walled and had 15 large gates. And from a historical perspective, what was Nineveh known for as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world? So the one that had the hanging gardens, if I remember correctly. Okay, so very beautiful city, very impressive city at the time, and God's going to destroy it. Okay, and why is he going to destroy it? Because of all the sins they committed against his people. And I think that was perfect, because that was I think it's my last slide. So Sennacherib's son and successor is Esarhaddon. And then Esarhaddon's son, Ashurbanipal, those are your two main kings for Nahum. And Assyria is going to reach their peak under those two kings. So Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, okay? And that was my last slide. Okay, so there's a little bit more for the introduction, which we'll do next week. Does anybody have any questions on the intro to Nahum? So it's a lot to do with this, well, it's everything to do with Assyria, but if you know some of Assyria's history, it'll help some of it make a little bit more sense. All right, good to see everybody. We'll see you next week.